Hi, I'm CJ and this is my RC channel. In this video, I'm going to be assembling the shock absorbers, and it looks like the majority of the components are metal. We are going to be doing a few things a little differently. For example, the spring choice is going to deviate from stock. I'm going to be using the progressive 2.5 to 2.8 springs front and rear. So I'll be using the same weight of springs front and rear. And that is going to be this starting setup. As you can see, I've already got a little box going. I've got a couple extra sets of springs other than what comes with the kit. The stock offering is a pair of the progressive 2.5, 2.8s, and a pair of the 2.6s. And I've got a couple other springs on the way. From what I have learned from the professional X-ray drivers, the lighter weight springs like these 2.3 to 2.6 progressives and the 2.5s get very little use, if any. So something to bear in mind when you're making your purchases. You may not want to buy those right away. In fact, all you really need right out of the box is an extra pair of the 2.5, 2.8s, because you already get one. And for everything I've seen, they are not using a mix like a progressive spring at one end of the car and a regular continuous rate spring at the other end. They use either progressive at both ends or either a continuous rate spring at both ends. Now I'm going to be using the progressive shock system. They come in pairs. I'm going to be using this on the front. This again is one of the pro tips recommended. It's part number 308029, and what I'll show you in detail how this actually works. But this is going to create a progressive damping, and it comes with a set of pistons that are specific to these inserts. As you'll notice, they have no holes in them. And that is as it should be. Now, just to quickly explain how this works, and this is a very delicate item, so be careful. That's why they have them in individual containers. The piston, aperture here, the larger aperture faces downward, and you kind of have this parabolic arc here on three sides. And as the piston begins to push upwards, a decent amount of space is available on three sides of the piston, as opposed to holes for fluid to pass through. And the higher the piston rises, the smaller that space becomes, meaning less fluid can pass. It's the equivalent of having holes that shrink and expand as the piston moves. And so this is going to give us a progressive damping, and the reason it's used in the front is to prevent the front end from dropping as easily on to prevent front end dive, like when you're braking hard, or if you initiate a sudden turn and the front end wants to compress the outside front suspension. The progressive nature of that shock is going to prevent that suspension from collapsing as rapidly and give the car time to kind of adjust and recover from that sudden input or change. Otherwise, the rear shocks are going to go together according to stock, and everything else will be the same. I am using a different fluid. Now, fluids are something that you kind of, it's hard to wrap your head around them because everybody's different. Let me set these parts aside here, and I want to pull a little document out. You can Google this up. This is basically a spreadsheet that compares the standard CST weight system to TLR's weight system for viscosity versus associateds. And as you can see, 20 pound is not the same on TLR versus associated. There's a difference all the way up the line. Now, what's recommended for these shocks is 450. That's the out-of-the-box recommendation. On several build sheets I've seen for asphalt, which is what I'm racing on, 500 is recommended. And so I need to get put this away and get some 40 weight TLR out, or 3.75 associated oil. And I have TLR 40. And I'm just checking on the 375 for the associated. I have that in another box. So this is what I'm going to be putting in my shocks today. And again, this is an initial build, so if I find that I think that's a little too heavy, I can always rebuild the shocks with the lighter fluid. It's no big deal. But I just wanted to show you that this is out there, and I would definitely go by this. I would get a copy. Just Google it up on, you'll find it in images. And it's probably printed a lot larger than the actual image size. I probably scaled it up and then printed it, just so that it would take up the full sheet of paper, make it easier to read. And you're going to want a caliper for this process, because you're going to want to be measuring your shocks as far as how much shock shaft is visible. And you're going to want a shock assembly tool. These are important things to have. So we are into bag 6. And these are aluminum components, which is nice. I am kind of surprised that they don't provide us with machined pistons, that they're giving us these molded plastic ones where we've got to trim the edges versus having a quality machined piston. Everything else in this kit is so high-end. I am a little surprised at that, but that's something that you can purchase on your own. I assume they do have those available. And here we have all our little O-rings and our C-clips or E-clips. I'm going to use a different tray for these. Just makes it easier. Make sure there's nothing left in there. Okay, so let me just review the build sheet and figure out which pistons I'm going to need for the two rears. I've already got my fronts, 4 holes, and the 1.1s. So, how you can tell, okay, there are 3 size holes in these pistons. First, there's the count. There's 4 hole pistons and 3 hole pistons. Then there's the size of the holes. They come in 1 millimeter, 1.1 millimeter, and 1.2. And the way you can tell is there's a numbering scheme. If you look here, you'll see a 1 and a 0. That's the 1.0. Then there's a 1 and a 1. That's the 1.1. And here we have 1 and 2. That is the 1.2. I need a pair of 1.1s. So I need this piston here, and I need this piston here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to cut out all of these, and I'm going to put them in the track box for future reference. So I'll have them if I want to try changing something up at the track. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. I'm going to cut out these components. I'm going to cut these out. You can use a pair of cutters on these pieces in the black parts trees. When it comes to these spacers here, which we're going to need, and it comes to the pistons, I highly recommend using an X-Acto knife with a brand new number 11 blade. Cut these carefully. You want to try to keep them as round as possible. You don't want to make a flat spot, because that's going to allow a little bit of fluid to pass along the side of the piston. So be careful as you cut these out, and store the ones that you aren't going to use in your build so that you have them later. You may not be doing the progressives. You may just be doing the straight up build. FYI, in the asphalt builds, everybody is using 4-hole pistons, and they are all using the 1.1 millimeter holes front and rear. And they're also using the same fluid front and rear, which is, like I said, it's a little strange that a lot of people are using the progressive spring in the front and the standard rate in the rear. That may be to kind of try to create a similar effect to what we get with the progressive springs. In any event, I'm going to be using progressive springs front and rear. When I get the extra 2 6s, I may try switching to have 2.6 front and rear. I've also got a set of 2.8s on the way, 2 pairs of them, and I may try 2.8 front and rear and see how that goes. Prior to X-Ray, I have never seen anybody, any vendor, show as many of the little tricks that I use in their directions as just standard build techniques. I have always taken a fine bearing oil, and once you put the O-rings into the shock adjusters, the spring preload adjusters, I always put a drop or 2 of thin oil on that O-ring to help these adjusters screw onto the shock bodies, because they can be, without that little bit of oil, they can be very stiff, and you can you risk cross-threading the shock body, and you also risk tearing the O-ring and just kind of seizing it up and not, you know, having a really hard time making any adjustments. And they recommend putting oil on there and or on the shock threads. And you will notice, if you try one without, you'll notice a tremendous difference at how easily these go together. Now this is, I kind of do my shocks in an assembly line fashion. You know, I do all of one thing. Like I put on all the pistons, I do all 4 O-rings, I put on all 4 preload adjusters. And I do that as far as the assembly process can go, to the point where I end up having to do, you know, several steps on just one at a time. It just kind of makes things go easier, I think. It's easier to keep track of all your little parts, and it's easier not to miss things. So like when you're, you know, putting oil on the O-ring, if you do it to all 4 O-rings at the same time, you know you didn't forget it, or miss it on one of them. These are extremely small shocks, and so everything has to be precise. So when you make adjustments to preload, you want to do that as carefully as possible. They don't have any kind of a marker on these. I think I've only seen one manufacturer put a marker on the preload adjusters. Putting a little drop of an enamel paint or something like that onto your preload adjusters is not a bad idea, because that way when you are trying to make an adjustment in turns, like you've got your shocks equalized, but you need to make the rear end a little stiffer. So you do 2 turns on the preload adjuster to tighten the rear. If you don't have a marker on there, it can be very difficult to tell whether you've made a turn, especially with this new color scheme they're using where everything is black. I actually kind of like the orange on black, because that way you've got a contrasting color and it makes it easier to see. Depending on what else is going on, when you've got a cap and a base and everything else, and everything is black, it can be hard to tell what's what. So, food for thought. Let's see, might as well do the pistons. And I need some O-ring grease. When you put on these E-clips, always make sure that you can rotate the clip. It's going to be tight usually. Sometimes they're loose once you clip them on. But if you can't rotate it without it popping out, that means you didn't get it properly seated. And that is a necessity. Do you find these videos to be helpful, useful to you? Then please help me keep this channel going by donating. Click the link up here and you can donate safely through PayPal on either a one-time or a monthly basis, your choice. You got to be careful with E-clips. The good thing is to keep your thumb over it when you're snapping it on, because if it springs off on you, you may never see it again. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the needle nose pliers at the top of the E-clip and onto the shock shaft, and then I put my thumb over top in case it springs off. It's not going to go anywhere. When you're doing the first E-clip, that's not as much of a danger. Notice that there is a very small hole. You might be able to see light through there or see my skin. That is a bleed hole and is supposed to be there. There's also another one here on this plastic piece. It's right there and comes out here, and that's why we have to use these bladders. That hole gives the bladder somewhere for the top of it to expand and contract. I'd rather use more of this O-ring grease than I need because the excess is just going to get pushed out by the shock shaft. It's like a conditioner for the O-rings. It prevents them from swelling, helps them keep seal against the shock shaft. So again, having more rather than less is better, because what you don't need will end up getting pushed out. Okay, now this is where I need to do two different than the other two. So those are my two pistons that have no holes. And one of them has a little bit of, it's just got a nick in it. So just wanted to make sure there wasn't any flashing. Okay, so I need to insert the inserts. I actually could have gone ahead and put this spacer and the bottom cap on first. You don't want to tighten this down all the way until you have pushed the piston through. Then you can tighten it all the way. Just cleaning off any excess grease that came along with my fingers. Okay, so now it is time to fill the shock absorbers. Actually, before I fill the shock absorbers, I'm going to go ahead and put on the eyelets on the bottom. And I believe that's the way they also show us in the instructions. Yes, they do. It makes it easier to measure. So if you have a pair of diagonal cutters, you can grab onto the very top of the threads, but don't grab on the smooth part of the shaft. You'll get a leak, and you don't want that. I need my other pair. These are too thick. They're too wide. Okay, this is a good pair, and as you can see, it's narrower. So that's going to allow me to get a grip on here, and I want to make sure I'm using the right size. That is the 3mm, and even these aren't going to go all the way. So once I get these part way done, I may need to use the diagonal cutters. We'll just see how they measure out once I get this tight. Eight millimeters, 0.02, so I can live with that little bit of variance. We're looking for, actually we're looking for 9mm, so I gotta go out a millimeter. Okay, 8.99, so that's what we're looking for. Eight, 7, 4. .06. I'm going to dial that in a little bit. .95. Let's go out just a hair. Nine, 8.99. You have to be consistent in the way you hold the calipers against the cap. 8.98. Great. Okay, so 4 holes, that's rear. No holes, that's one of the fronts. 4 holes, that's the rear. So those are my fronts, these are my rears. That's important to keep these separated. In fact, I'm going to put a mark on the plastic somewhere, like down here, just so I know that those are my rears. This silver Sharpie, silver metallic, is great for leaving permanent marks on dark plastic. Turn that off. See, and one of the reasons you want to put the spring adjusters is because they give you something to hang your shocks by. If you don't have those on, it becomes a little more difficult. Oh, that's right, I've got to there's a plug in these. What you want to do is fill it up close to the top, but not to the top. You want to raise your piston up and pull it down quickly, not so quickly that the oil shoots up in your face, but enough to get any air bubbles to come from below the piston through the holes and around the sides so that they are above the piston. Add a little more fluid now, and then I'm just going to leave this to sit and wait for any air bubbles to rise, and then I'll exercise the piston a second time. Okay, if you notice down here on page 30, we have an optional foam insert that goes in between the, what do they call it exactly? I forget the exact name for that part. Just get that so no one calls me on it. They call it the shock absorber membrane. Okay, in any event, in between the membrane and the cap, there's an optional foam insert. Those are not included in the kit. You got to buy them separately. They don't even give us a part number here. Nobody is using them on all of the build sheets that I have looked at. Not a single person is using the foam inserts. So I would just not, I wouldn't go with those. I wouldn't even bother looking. Most people are running either no rebound or 25% rebound. How to set your rebound is discussed here on page 31 in great detail. It's a matter of bleeding the shock until you hit that level. So let's just see. Okay, both of those are rears. And just like with the grease for the O-rings, I'd rather lose a little bit of fluid than not have enough and have to open the shock again. I'm going to exercise these a second time. I'm pushing up, not to the top, and then pulling down quickly. And I saw a couple little bubbles come up. So I'm going to let that sit. And repeat this process for all of these. Yeah, got a little bit there too. Now there's a special tool. It's kind of like a vacuum pump thing. I've never used one. They're pretty expensive. It's a hoodie tool. And if you are so inclined and have the budget for said tool, by all means. It depends also on how much racing you're doing, how much shock rebuilding you're doing. If you're rebuilding your shocks 2 or 3 times a weekend and testing, setting up for each track, yeah, I would recommend getting that. If you get a good build going and then you just leave your car like that through most of the season, maybe you rebuild the shocks once or twice over the entire season, I don't think it's worth the money. I think you're better off putting it into other things. Okay, I'm going to pause again. I'm going to let them sit until the bubbles have completely risen up to the top. They're starting to get there. This one looks like it's got a little lint on top. I'll have to see if I can... Got it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please click like and please subscribe to my channel. If you click the bell icon, you'll receive notifications every time I launch a new video. Thank you for watching.